The beekeeper arrived on a Tuesday in late October when the maples had gone copper and the cold was just beginning to mean it, and what she found at the edge of the Harrow property was not, by any reasonable measure, promising. 20 hive boxes, their paint long since surrendered to the weather, stood in a ragged row along the fence line, like old men who had forgotten why they were waiting. The grass around them grew in pale, exhausted clumps. The nearest water was a silted-over stock pond 40 yards through scrub. And the bees themselves, the bees that filled those boxes, that clustered and hummed in the October chill with the slow, deliberate patience of creatures who have outlasted worse things than this, were of a variety that most beekeepers in the county had quietly decided were more trouble than they were worth. They were carniolans, or so the old man Harrow had always called them, though they were not the common carniolan stock you could order from a catalog. They were something older than that, something that had been bred and selected and held together in this one place for longer than anyone in Calvert's Creek could say with certainty. They were, in the words of the man who sold them to Clara Voss, for $19 and a handshake, a dying line. That was what he said. Dying line. He said it the way a person says a thing they have decided is a fact so that they don't have to feel bad about what they're doing. Clara was 24 years old. She had $47 in her coat pocket, a jar of sourwood honey she'd been given at the county fair 3 years prior that she still had not opened because she wanted to keep it, and a piece of land her grandmother had left her that the neighbors considered a charitable description of the word. She handed over 19 of those dollars, kept the other 28 for whatever came next, and stood in the October cold looking at 20 boxes of bees that the whole of Calvert's Creek had already decided were not worth saving. 2 years earlier, she thought to herself. Then we'll see. 2 years earlier would have placed Clara Voss behind the counter of Maddox's dry goods store on the main road, folding bolts of cloth and writing figures in a ledger and listening to the farmers talk. She was good at listening. Most people who came into Maddox were not aware she was doing it. They saw a young woman in a store apron and assumed that whatever she heard went in one ear and out the other, which was a comfortable assumption for them and a useful one for her. She listened to the farmers talk about their hay yields and their soil, and which parcels of land were worth something, and which were played out. She listened to the beekeepers, and there were a dozen of them in the county then, talk about what honey was fetching, and where the nectar flows ran strongest, and which varieties of bee gave them the least trouble. She had listened for 2 years. She had not been idle about it. She had written things down in a small book she kept in her apron pocket, recording not just what people said, but what she noticed they avoided saying. And one of the things she noticed the beekeepers consistently avoided saying was anything useful about the Harrow bees. They went quiet when old Harrow's name came up. They would speak in a general, dismissive way, the way people speak about a difficult subject they have agreed not to examine too closely. Too aggressive, some said. Hard to work. Old-fashioned, another said, with the particular scorn of someone who mistakes novelty for improvement. But there was one man, a beekeeper from over near the river named Ponder, with hands so cracked and brown they looked carved from walnut, who had once said something different. He had said, "Those bees winter like nothing you have ever seen." He had said it quickly, as though he'd let it slip, and then he'd changed the subject. Clara had written it down. She had also, in those 2 years of listening, visited the county land records and read everything written about the Harrow parcel. She had walked it in the spring before her grandmother died, on a Sunday afternoon when no one was watching, and she had noticed what it actually contained, as opposed to what people said it contained. They said it was rocky and played out and good for nothing. What she found was a south-facing slope with a shallow loam over clay that held water through a dry summer, a strip of basswood along the eastern fence that bloomed reliable in July, and 2 acres of white Dutch clover gone wild along the creek margin. She had knelt in that clover and listened to the sound, which was a continuous, low, cellular vibration the sound of something enormously alive and entirely overlooked. She had thought, whoever puts bees on this land will have something. The question was only what kind of bees, and for how long, and whether they could be made to last long enough for the land to speak on their behalf. She had thought about that on the walk back to town. She was still thinking about it when old Harrow came into Maddox 6 months later to sell his hives, and she handed him $19 before he had finished explaining what he was offering. The neighbors saw the hives go up on the Voss land on a Wednesday morning in early November. 20 boxes trundled down the creek road on a borrowed wagon and set along the fence line where Clara had decided they would have the best exposure to the morning sun. By noon, 3 people had stopped to look. By evening, the general verdict of Calvert's Creek had been rendered without a trial. Margaret Flood, who farmed the next parcel over and had an opinion on everything that crossed into her line of sight, said what most of them were thinking. A girl, that age alone, can't manage a bee yard of that size. It requires a man who knows what he's about. She said it to 6 people before the week was out, and each of them agreed, which is how a town decides a thing is true. A boy named Eli, who was 11 years old and lived with his grandmother 2 farms down, watched from the fence post and said nothing, which was unusual for him, because he was normally a child who had something to say about everything. He watched Clara move among the hives with a calmness that he found interesting. She did not hurry. She did not appear frightened. She simply moved as though she knew what she was doing, and as though the bees, who moved around her in loose exploratory arcs, had no particular objection to her presence. He came back the next morning and watched again, from the same post. Clara pretended not to notice him for 3 days, which was about the right amount of time. On the 4th day she said, without looking up from the hive she was inspecting, "Come over here and look at this." He came. She showed him the cluster. "This is how they winter," she said. "They pull together and generate heat from the middle. The ones on the outside are always rotating in. Nobody freezes." Eli looked at the cluster with the expression children wear when something has just become more interesting than they expected. "Is that true for all bees?" he asked. She told him it was, but that different kinds of bees did it with different degrees of commitment, and that what she had come to believe about these particular bees was that they did it better than most. She did not have proof of this yet. She was careful to say so. But Eli seemed to find the hypothesis as interesting as the proof would have been, which told her something about the quality of the child's mind, and she let him come back. He began appearing every morning before school and every afternoon after, which his grandmother permitted, because she said the girl clearly knew what she was doing and the boy needed something to do with his hands and his head. His grandmother's name was Sable, and she was 71 years old, and she had come to Calvert's Creek from a place in the hills of western North Carolina, where her family had kept bees for 4 generations. She had not kept bees herself for 20 years, on account of a back that had given up on the relevant labor, but she had not forgotten what she knew. Sable Bright came to the fence one evening in December, wrapped in a wool coat the color of creek mud, and she stood for a while watching Clara work by lantern light. Then she said, "Those bees are not what people think they are." Clara looked up. Sable said, "My grandfather knew a line like this. He called them the gray bees. Said they were old. Said old in that particular way that means something has been tested and has passed." Clara set down her tool and waited because she recognized that the old woman was not finished. "There is a thing they do," Sable said, "that I have not seen in any other bee in 40 years of watching. In a poor summer, not a bad summer, mind you, a poor one, the kind where there's just enough to survive, they reduce their brood. They rear fewer young. They do not starve themselves building population they cannot feed. They manage their numbers to what the land can support." She paused. "Most beekeepers think that is a fault." Clara thought about this for a moment. "Most beekeepers want big populations," she said. "That's exactly right," Sable said. And when the big population hives hit a hard year, they collapse. These ones do not. They shrink and wait and come back stronger the following spring. She looked at the hive boxes in the January dark. They have been called the gray bees because they are quiet, she said. They do not swarm in panic. They do not starve in pride. They are patient. That is not a fault. That is old wisdom the bees worked out long before we arrived with our opinions. She went home. Clara stood alone in the dark for a long time, thinking about patience and the arithmetic of survival and the things a bee knows that a beekeeper is still learning. The first winter was the one that mattered most, and it was, by every measure, an unpleasant one. January came in hard. The temperature dropped in the second week and did not recover for a month. The creek froze to the bottom at the ford. A farmer 2 miles north lost his whole flock of sheep to a cold snap that arrived without the courtesy of warning. 2 beekeepers in the county opened their hives in February to check their stores and found dead clusters, whole colonies that had starved within 3 inches of capped honey because they had been too cold to break cluster and move to it. This happened to Raymond Fowler, who ran 40 hives on the east side of the county and was considered the most experienced beekeeper for 20 miles. He lost 11. He did not say anything about it publicly, but it got around the way things do, and people mentioned it in the same breath as a hard winter, and the unpredictability of bees and various other causes that had nothing to do with the variety of bee he had chosen to keep. Clara did not say anything either. She was too busy doing the arithmetic. 20 hives going in. The calculation was this. If the harrow bees overwintered at the rate Sable described, she would expect to crack the lids in March and find colonies of a size that would allow her to split them. If she could split carefully, not greedily, not more than the colonies could sustain, she could double her count. 40 hives by June. And 40 hives on land with the basswood strip and the creek clover, in a summer with reasonable weather, would produce a quantity of honey that she had done the math on in the small book, and the number had made her press her lips together and look out the window for a moment, in the particular way a person does when a number is better than they let themselves hope. She cracked the first lid on a mild day in early March when the temperature had climbed enough to make it safe. She looked for a long moment. Then she moved to the second box, and the third, and down the line. What she found was this: 20 colonies, 20 living clusters. Some had contracted, some had lost population, as Sable said they would in a lean winter. But every one of them was alive, and had stores remaining, and a queen who had already begun to lay. Clara closed the last lid. She walked back to the house without running, because she was not the kind of person who runs, but she walked with a quality in her step that anyone watching would have recognized as the controlled motion of a person who is containing a very large feeling. Eli was at the fence. Every one, she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at the row of hives. That's something, he said. It was exactly that. The spring unfolded in the careful, methodical way that good work unfolds, which is to say mostly without drama and entirely without shortcuts. Clara split 14 of the strongest colonies in April, taking care not to overextend any hive she wasn't certain could sustain the division, and she raised the additional queens from the best layers in the original 20. She had read about queen rearing in a manual she had borrowed twice from the county agricultural office, paying for the loan with a jar of honey each time. She had corresponded, by letter, with a woman in Virginia who kept bees commercially, and who wrote back with specific and useful information, because she had recognized in Clara's letters something she respected, which was precision. The Virginia woman's name was Dorothy Crane, and she wrote, "Your instinct about the brood reduction trait is sound. I have heard of lines that do this. If yours is genuinely self-regulating in that way, you have something that cannot be ordered from a catalog. Protect it. Do not sell your queens before you know what you have." Clara had read that letter 4 times, and then placed it in the small book. She did not sell any queens that year. She did not split past 34 hives. She kept the arithmetic clean, enough growth to expand, not so much that she outran her ability to manage. She watched the basswood bloom in July and positioned her strongest hives within good foraging range of it, which she had mapped on paper the previous fall when she was deciding where each box would stand. By August, the honey was coming in at a rate that she kept to herself. This was deliberate. She had watched enough of the county's small farmers in her 2 years behind the Maddox counter to understand a principle of modest means and early success. If you tell people what you have before you are certain it will last, you invite interference before you are strong enough to withstand it. So, she extracted quietly in the evenings in the old honey house behind the barn that she had repaired with salvaged lumber in May. She processed 37 frames in the first pull, then 51 in the second. She stacked the full jars on the cellar shelves and counted them by lantern, and arrived at a number that she allowed herself to feel very briefly as an emotion, and then recomposed into a practical question, which was, who do I sell to, and at what price, and how do I find out what this honey is actually worth before someone tells me what it's worth in a way that serves their interest and not mine? The answer to that question arrived in the form of a man named Samuel Green, who came through Calvert's Creek in September, driving a wagon of goods destined for a hotel in the city. He stopped at Maddox, as travelers always did, and made the mistake of mentioning to Maddox himself that the hotel was having a difficult time sourcing quality local honey as the regular supplier had failed the summer prior. Maddox mentioned Clara. Samuel Green found his way down the creek road that afternoon. He tasted 3 varieties, the spring honey, the basswood pull, and the late summer clover, without saying anything for a long moment after each. Then he set down the spoon and looked at the jars on the cellar shelf, which Clara had allowed him to see because she had already decided she wanted him to understand the quantity involved before the price was discussed. A man who sees abundance prices differently than a man who imagines scarcity. And Clara had not spent 2 years listening to farmers for nothing. Samuel Green said, "This basswood is unlike anything I have tasted in this state." He said it the way an honest man says something true. She told him the price. He paid it, which was higher than the county rate and somewhat below what she calculated the hotel would be able to bear, which meant it was a fair price for both parties and the kind of arrangement that continues. He loaded 36 jars into the wagon, gave her a receipt and a handshake, and drove away, looking thoughtful. She stood in the yard and looked at the remaining jars in the cellar and the number of hives on the fence line and the basswood along the eastern edge beginning to go gold in the September air. And she allowed herself one small, private moment of something that was not quite pride and not quite relief, but occupied the territory between them. Then she went back to work. The second year was when it turned. Not turned in the sense of a sudden reversal, nothing real turned suddenly, whatever people say, but turned in the sense of a river that has been running underground, finding its way back to the surface. People in Calvert's Creek began to notice things. They noticed that Clara Voss's hives had come through the winter intact when experienced men's hives had not. They noticed the wagon from the city coming twice more in the spring, and Samuel Green was not a man who revisited a disappointment. They noticed the basswood honey at the church social in August, where Clara had brought 6 jars as a donation and where the jars were empty within 20 minutes, and 3 separate people asked where it had come from and could they purchase more. Margaret Flood, who had rendered the original verdict on Clara's prospects, tasted the basswood honey on a biscuit at that social and said, without appearing to remember what she had said 18 months prior, "That girl knows what she's doing." This was not an apology. It was not intended to be, but it was the end of that particular sentence, and in a small community that counts for something. Eli, who was 12 now, had become functionally essential to the operation of the bee yard in the way that children become essential to things they care about, not through sentimentality, but through the accretion of genuine knowledge. He could read a brood frame as well as anyone Clara had seen. He knew the bees by hive, which is a thing that sounds impractical until you understand that knowing a hive's temperament and tendencies is the same as knowing a field's drainage. It is the knowledge that keeps you from making expensive mistakes. He had named every colony, which Clara found more amusing than she let on, because she was not the sort of person who named things. He had named the strongest one Patience, and the second strongest Persistence, and the third one Gerald, for reasons he declined to explain. It was in the second spring that the trouble arrived, as trouble generally does, dressed in something that looked like an opportunity. His name was Warren Coates. He ran a produce and goods operation out of the county seat that had been expanding in the way of operations run by men who confuse size with quality into honey distribution in the region. He drove a fine buggy and wore clothes that had never been tested by actual weather, and he arrived on a Tuesday in May with a man in a suit who turned out to be some variety of business agent, and he stood in the yard and looked at the hives and the expanded yard, 41 now after careful spring splitting, and he smiled with the particular warmth of a man who has already decided what he wants and is waiting to explain why you will agree. "Miss Voss," he said. He said it slowly, as if her name required handling. He said he had heard about her operation and thought she would benefit from an arrangement with his distribution network. He could move her entire honey output, he said, the whole season. She would not have to worry about buyers, he said, and here he allowed a small, careful pause. For a woman operating alone, that simplification was surely worth something. She let him say all of it. She had learned from 2 years behind a counter that a man talking is a man revealing himself, and Warren Coates revealed in approximately 8 minutes 3 things of use: that he already knew her production numbers with a precision that suggested someone in Calvert's Creek had been reporting to him that his offered price was 40% below what Samuel Green was paying, and that his agent had a paper ready, which is not a thing a fair offer requires. She told him she was under an existing arrangement. He said, and here his warmth cooled by a precise, calculated degree, that existing arrangements with small buyers tended to be fragile, and that the county had seen drought years in the past and would again, and that a reliable distribution partner would provide stability that a single hotel contract could not. He said, "Someone in your position can't afford to be exposed." She met his eyes. "I'll consider it," she said. It was not a yes. He heard it as one. He drove away satisfied. Clara walked directly to Sable Bright's house and sat in the kitchen and said, "How much do you know about Warren Coates?" Sable poured coffee. "Enough," she said. "Enough for this." What Sable knew, and had known, it turned out, for several years, was that Warren Coates had twice before identified successful small operations in neighboring counties, offered them contracts with his distribution network, and in both cases had, within 1 season, leveraged the contract's terms to buy out the underlying land at a reduced price when the operator could not meet conditions that had been written vaguely enough to be interpreted to his advantage. She knew this because one of those operators was her cousin's neighbor in the next county, and word comes home eventually. Clara listened to all of it. Then she asked about the contract paper his agent had carried. What would it have said? Sable said, "It would have said that all production of every hive on this property is committed to his network for 3 years at his stated price, with a penalty clause for shortfall, and the penalty would be collateralized against the land." Clara looked at her coffee. "That is a mechanism," she said, "for taking the land." "That is what it is," Sable said. Clara thought about the document and the smoothly produced pen, and the warm smile, and the phrase, "someone in your position," and she felt something that was not quite anger. Anger is a hot thing, and what she felt was cold and clarifying, like the first hard frost that kills the soft things and leaves the structure visible. She said, "He already knows my production numbers. He's spoken to someone here." Sable said, "He has." Clara said, "How did he know the count?" Sable looked at her steadily. "There's only one person who's been in that yard often enough to count for him." Clara was quiet. Then she said, "Not Eli, not that child." Sable shook her head. "No, not the boy. It was Maddock. It was the man who had employed her for 2 years, who had mentioned her to Samuel Green, who had known her output because she had, in a moment of uncalculated trust, told him what she was producing when he asked how things were going. He had been talking to Coates for months. She did not confront him. She did not need to. She understood that a man who would sell information about a young woman's work to a larger interest would not respond to confrontation with honesty, and honesty was not what she needed from him. What she needed was a witness and a paper of her own, and those she went and obtained. She rode to the county seat on a Thursday and spoke to a lawyer named Addis, who owed her grandmother's estate a courtesy of 2 years' standing, and she described the situation plainly and asked what a person in her position could do. Addis told her about consideration and contract law, and the way Pennsylvania landholding rights applied to a woman of legal age running a commercial operation in her own name, which was not nothing. She drafted a letter to Samuel Green, describing the pressure she was under and asking him to formalize their arrangement in writing at his earliest convenience, and Green, who was an honest man and who had already told his hotel that the basswood honey was a regular supply, sent the signed agreement within 10 days. Then the summer arrived with what it had been planning for months, and what it had been planning was drought. This was the thing that Warren Coates had half predicted and fully intended to use, though he had meant to use it from inside a contract that he never got. The creek dropped to a trickle by the end of June. The clover burned back to bare red clay. The basswood bloomed late and thin, visited by fewer pollinators than any summer Clara could measure. Other beekeepers in the county watched their colonies exhaust their stores and begin to starve. Raymond Fowler, who had lost 11 hives to the winter, lost 7 more to the drought. A man named Heist, who ran 25 hives on orchard land 2 miles east, opened his boxes in late July to find 14 of them in collapse. Populations blown out, stores empty, the particular grief of a summer's work undone in 3 weeks of dry heat. It was everywhere, the way a drought is, total and impartial, and specifically cruel to anyone who had not anticipated it. Warren Coates sent a letter. It was phrased in the warmth of concern. He said he hoped she was weathering the difficult season. He said his offer remained open, and that given the conditions he would be understanding if her production was reduced, and that perhaps they could discuss revised terms. He did not say what the revised terms would be. She did not respond. She was busy. She was busy because of what Sable had told her about the brood reduction behavior, and what she now had 2 full years of observation to confirm. The gray bees, and she had started calling them that, in the privacy of her small book, had done precisely what old wisdom said they would. When the nectar flow dropped in June, the colonies had already begun to reduce their brood. They had not continued building population into a summer that could not support it. They had not starved themselves expanding. They had pulled back, stored what they found, and consolidated. The result, in the last week of July, when Clara pulled her frames for the summer extraction, was this: less honey than the previous year's extraordinary surplus, considerably less, but enough. The arithmetic came out to enough. She ran it 3 times. She had, in a drought summer that had ruined every beekeeper she knew of in the county, produced enough. Not a triumph of quantity, a triumph of survival. Being right is its own kind of reply. She extracted 61 jars in July and 48 in August, and she drove to the county seat and delivered them personally to Samuel Green's warehouse, and she saw the look on his face when she arrived, because he had wondered in the drought whether she would. She told him every jar promised. He said, "How?" She said, "Old bees." He looked at the jars for a moment. Then he said, "I want to know more about this line." She told him as much as she thought was useful and charged him the same fair price as before, and went home. What happened next is the kind of thing that happens in a small community after a hard summer, when hunger and loss have changed the light, and people look at things they had dismissed and see them differently. Raymond Fowler came to the fence in September. He was a large man with a careful, methodical quality to him that Clara had always respected, even when he was among those who had doubted her. He stood at the fence for a while. Then he said, "I lost 17 hives this summer in total since last fall." She waited. He said, "I am not a man who asks for charity, but I am a man who knows when he has been wrong, and I was wrong about those bees." He said, "If you have queens to sell from that line, I want to talk about a price." She looked at him. "I don't have queens available," she said. He nodded, expecting it. She said, "But I may have splits in the spring if the colonies build as I expect." He looked at the hive line. "At what price?" She thought about it. "At the fair price," she said, "not the price of advantage." He nodded. They shook hands on that basis, which is a different kind of paper from a contract and, between the right people, more reliable. Heist came the following week, and she had the same conversation with him. Margaret Flood came, which surprised Clara more than she allowed herself to show. Margaret said, standing in the yard with the October maples going copper all around them, "I should not have said what I said." That is a specific kind of courage in a woman of that character, and Clara received it without gloating, which cost her less than it might have cost a smaller person. She said, "Come back in the spring, and we'll talk about what I have." Margaret nodded, and something shifted between them that is not easily named, but is what happens when respect, late though it may be, arrives honestly. Even Maddock, who had talked to Coates, came by. He did not address what he had done. He looked at the hives and said, "I suppose you knew what you were about all along." Clara said nothing to this. Sometimes that is the exactly right reply. Warren Coates did not come back in person. He sent the agent with the papers, one more time, in late September, when the drought had done its work and he could calculate that his position was strongest. The agent knocked. Clara opened the door and said, "Mr. Coates should know that I have a contract in place with Green & Sons Distribution for the coming 3 years, signed and registered with the county clerk, and that I have retained Addis in the matter of any future approach to this property." She said it pleasantly, in the same plain tone she used for everything, as though she were describing the weather. The agent folded his hat in his hands and said he would convey that information. He left. She did not watch him go because there was work to do, and the work had always been more interesting than the opposition. Sable came to dinner that evening, and Eli came too, because Eli was at the point of being essentially part of the household in all practical ways, and they sat at the table with bread and the last of the summer vegetables, and a jar of the basswood honey open between them. And Sable said, "My grandfather used to say that the gray bees understand something most people do not." She poured honey on her bread. He said they understand that being small and patient is not a weakness. It is the oldest strategy. She looked at Clara. "You understood that," she said. "That is why you are sitting here, and not him." Clara thought about that for a moment. "I understood what they were," she said. "I didn't understand yet what I was." Sable smiled at her. "And now?" Clara thought about 20 hive boxes on a fence line in October 3 years ago, and the $19, and the 2 years of listening, and the hard winter, and the 3 splits, and the drought summer, and the 61 jars, and the 48 jars, and Samuel Green's face, and Raymond Fowler's handshake, and the agent folding his hat, and Eli at the fence post every morning, without fail. She looked at the honey on the bread, pale gold in the lamplight, the particular color of something that had been made slowly and in difficulty, and with the whole strength of small creatures working at the edge of their capacity. "I understand," she said. "I think I finally understand." Outside, the October dark pressed against the windows, and somewhere out on the fence line, in their boxes, the gray bees were beginning to pull together, as they always did when the cold came, the outer ones rotating to the center, no one freezing, everyone sharing the warmth of the work, patient and entire, and quietly, stubbornly, magnificently alive. It is a thing worth saying plainly, now that the whole of it can be seen. The bees were never dying. The line was never finished. What was dying was the belief that they were worth anything, and that is an entirely different problem, one that belongs to the people, not to the bees. Clara Voss understood this before she fully understood herself, which is perhaps the beginning of wisdom. By the third year, she had 47 hives. By the fifth, she had accepted, carefully and without overextension, 4 neighboring beekeepers into the practice of keeping the gray line, selling them splits at the fair price, advising them on management, maintaining the breeding stock with the precision that Dorothy Crane in Virginia had taught her by letter, over the course of 2 years of correspondence that had become as close to friendship as either of them allowed it to be named. The line she had bought for $19 had become, within a decade, something that beekeepers from 3 counties were making inquiries about, not because she had advertised or promoted it, but because the hives kept surviving the winters and the droughts and the hard summers that knocked back everyone else's colonies, and bees that survive are, in the end, their own argument. Eli Bright, and he had taken to writing his name thus by then, the Bright being his grandmother's name, and an honest description of him, became a beekeeper in his own right on a parcel of land to the south, and he managed his own queen line with the same patience and precision Clara had taught him, beginning from the morning she had said, "Come over here and look at this," and he had come. Sable lived to see the 5th year of it, which she said was enough to know how it ended, and she was right. On the last morning Clara sat with her, Sable said, "They are patient. That is not a fault. That is old wisdom." She had said it before. Clara knew she was saying it again on purpose. The things that matter are worth repeating. The basswood strip along the eastern fence grew thicker each year as Clara put in additional trees along the margin, planning 10 years out in the patient, unfashionable way of someone who has learned from creatures that have been making this calculation for longer than memory. The hives hummed through the winters and expanded through the springs and poured their strange, pale honey into frames all through the long summers, and the honey tasted, as Samuel Green had told the hotel, and the hotel had told its guests, and the guests had told their friends, like something made in a place where the old method still held, which was, in every sense that mattered, entirely true. The land that the neighbors had called played out produced, in its 10th year, a honey yield that Clara did not announce and did not display, and simply entered in the small book in the plain arithmetic of a life that had chosen patience over haste and observation over opinion, and the quiet, stubborn persistence of small creatures over every large and confident thing that had said it could not be done. She closed the book and set it on the shelf and went out to check the fence-line hives in the October dark, moving among them with a lantern held low, and the bees moved around her in the lamplight as they always did, unhurried and whole, and the whole arrangement, the woman, the hives, the basswood, the dark, the creek below, the cold coming on, looked to anyone who might have seen it exactly like the thing it was, not an ending, not a triumph declared, but a life in the full and patient midst of itself, still working, still watching, still learning what the gray bees had always known.